Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Daniel McAdams is with me today, and it's good to see you, Daniel.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Daniel, we have a special guest today who's going to explain to us how the Congress worked and why they always spend too much money. He is the expert on the finances of Congress. Mike Lofgren. Mike is our guest. Mike, thank you for being with us today.
Good to be here, Dr. Paul.
Good. Mike did spend a lot of time in Washington, like 28 years, and he didn't solve all the problems. So I want to know where the problems are. You've written about that, and the book that gets people's attention is The Deep State. And that's a subject that we've dealt with on this program, and you talk about this, and you use your experience, in the Congress. But tell us a little bit about what your goals were and maybe the biggest frustration you had while being in Washington and in government.
Well, I think what I'm trying to expose is that this partisan circus that the media concentrate on so greatly is something of a charade. I mean, there are two parties. They certainly have different views on social issues like gay marriage or abortion, things like that. But on the big money issues, who gets what? Who gets the contracts? The whole infrastructure of permanent war and all the money that's flowing into the military-industrial complex. On that, they're somewhat similar. There may be differences, but there are more nuances than outright differences. You'll notice that who was Barack Obama, the candidate for hope and change, in 2009 when he assumed office? Who does he appoint as Secretary of Defense? It was Bob Gates, who was not only George W. Bush's Secretary of Defense, who engineered the surge that Obama campaigned against. He's been a Bush dynasty consigliere back to the early 1980s. Or in the Treasury, you've got Tim Geithner. He and Hank Paulson, Bush's Secretary of the Treasury, were birds of a feather.
Well, that is for sure. That's something that I've been preaching for a long time. There's no difference between the two parties, and you make that point so clearly. But there was a title to an article that you wrote that caught my attention, and I think it's interesting in sorting out how these things come about. And this was the title that was in The Guardian. It says, "An oligarchy has broken our democracy." And I just want to see if I'm misunderstanding this, because I don't have high regards for democracy in some ways, because the democracy means that, all you have to do is get a majority vote and you can do whatever you want. So if the oligarchs get together and they control the vote, they get control of government. Now, is that a lot different than your understanding? Or I know there can be different definitions for democracy, but I think sometimes democracy might set this up instead of having a government that just is there for one purpose, and that's to protect our liberties rather than sorting out the majority vote.
Well, I think our Constitution is supposed to do that. We have representative democracy. We have, in theory, the public voting for representatives. We have balances of power, checks and balances, and three co-equal branches of government. But what I think has happened is we don't see that anymore, partly because of the aspects of the deep state that I've seen over the years take over. When the executive branch wants to go to war, the legislative branch pretty much rolls over. And as far as the judicial branch, they believe in these phony doctrines like the State Secrets Act, which was actually made based on perjured testimony in about 1953 following the crash of a U.S. Air Force aircraft. So they're basically giving carte blanche to the executive branch based on perjured testimony.
Right. Daniel.
Mike, first I want to say how happy I am to have you on the show. You know, back in 2000 when I first moved to Washington, and I was amongst the neocons. A mutual friend of ours, John Lofgren, who's now on the board of our Ron Paul Institute, introduced us, and I was so happy to finally have a kindred spirit. And over the years, of course, we had lunch together quite often on the Hill, so it's wonderful to have you. And I'm so glad that you've written these books that you've done, especially this latest one, which is so interesting and it rings so true. But of course, as I always do when I'm looking at the book, I go to Amazon and I always want to click on the 1-star reviews because those are in some ways the more interesting ones. And it struck me when I looked at some of the 1-star, and there weren't many, thankfully, on your book, the 1-star reviews, it was essentially the same. He sounds like a leftist. What's his problem with conservatives? And I was thinking as I was reading that, this is exactly the problem. Anyone who criticizes the system as such is either, oh, he sounds like a liberal, or he sounds like a right-wing kook. How do you respond? Am I on target with this?
Well, I don't know. Perhaps Karl Rove's American Crossroads pays people to go on Amazon and give these 1-star reviews. That's my own comment on it. I tend to think that ideology as such tends to be a mental cage, and that when you think things through pragmatically based on real principles and how you're going to solve the problem, you will sound out of the mainstream because most people use their ideologies and their partisan affiliations as a kind of crutch not to think and to become part of a herd and to follow the herd instinct. And that's what I'm not about. And I'll tell you, my sort of falling off the horse on the road to Damascus was the whole surreal period between 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq. I looked at all the intel regarding Iraq and its so-called weapons of mass destruction. I looked at all the intel regarding its so-called affiliation with Al-Qaeda, and it looked very weak, sketchy, circumstantial, and blown out of proportion. Yet people were going kind of like lemmings rushing off a cliff to follow the leader, George Bush, Dick Cheney, and the rest of their cabal of neocon, basically, we can call them warmongers. And that's where I got the idea that this whole ideology business, at least as it's practiced within the Beltway, is antithetical to thinking.
You know, go ahead.
No, go ahead, sir.
No, I was going to follow up on this concept of the deep state, because I agree with you entirely about you know, how the oligarchs and the special interests you know, protect themselves and take control of things. But it's pretty evident. But a lot of times when I talk about or think about the deep state, I often think about the CIA and something that is so deep, it's the deeper state, because I am not sure anybody in Washington, other than those who are running it, know about it. I can't even understand how a single president might be able to control some of the secrecy that goes in government because they have secret financing and all these things. Do you think that most of the problem that you see is the type of thing that you concentrate on here, on how the finances work and the lobbying works and Congress goes to sleep and they run roughshod over us? Or could you talk me into saying, well, be less concerned about the secret state because we can't figure that out?
Well, I mean, it really is a problem. I will aver to that. I mean, we can go back to the 50s. Allen W. Dulles was pulling the wool over Eisenhower's eyes. He was engineering the Bay of Pigs invasion under Eisenhower, approving the flights of the U-2 over Russia just when Ike was attempting to conduct a summit meeting with Russia. It embarrassed him tremendously. And of course, once John Kennedy got elected and in office, you know, he was wet behind the ears. He didn't understand all the ramifications of what was going on. The the Bay of Pigs invasion was already engineered and in the box and ready to be let out. And it was a complete disaster. And we have the same things today. We have John Brennan, who was a senior official at the CIA under Bush. He was the man in 2008 who schooled President Obama in foreign policy. And I think he may have been one of the reasons that Obama, who was going to filibuster against the FISA Amendments Act, which retroactively legalized illegal behavior on the part of the telecoms, that's why he ended up voting for it. He was surrounded by Brennan and people like him, which is also why presidents, they may differ in their views and they have a certain amount of power, but that power is limited in scope because of the people who surround them. Let's remember that one of Dick Cheney's foreign policy advisors was Victoria Nuland. She's now Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. She's one of the people who engineered the coup in Kiev in her infamous unencrypted cell phone call with Jeffrey Pyatt, our U.S. ambassador. She said, "Oh, this is the guy we're going to choose to become Prime Minister of Ukraine." Now, the Soviet or the Russian intelligence service, you can bet they'd be listening to that kind of traffic occurring in a country on their border, and you can be sure they would react as they reacted. If the Chinese were conspiring to take over the government of Canada in Ottawa, we'd be sending Abrams tanks over the border in about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Mike, if I can read something from the preface of the book, because I thought, to me, it spoke to something that I've wanted to write in a way that I wish I could write, and it just captures it so perfectly. So if you don't mind, maybe I can just read it and you can react to this. Said, during the first years after 9/11, Washington's neoclassical core was defaced by checkpoints, miles of hideous Jersey wall, and swarms of ninja-suited security squads. The city began to look less like Pierre L'Enfant's architectural vision of the neoclassical capital of a virtuous republic and more like Cold War East Berlin. But what fascinated me most was to watch the reaction of tourists. A large number actually seemed impressed by the display. It was just like television, and they were in real life caught up in some drama out of a Tom Clancy novel or an episode of 24. It was something they could relate to via their media conditioning. One suspects the vast majority of Americans' acquiescence at airports and acceptance of surveillance can be traced to similar behavioral roots. If one is patted down or watched by the government, it is somehow reassuring to be worthy of all that trouble. I think that captures the conditioning of Americans so perfectly.
Well, it is a kind of conditioning, and we can see it in big ways and small through TV series like 24, which always have the ticking time bomb scenario that's not necessarily credible. I recall once that Michael Chertoff, who was the head of the Department of Homeland Security, actually went to some confab at the Heritage Foundation in which they bestowed an award on 24, and Chertoff was acting like a fan at the Hollywood premiere of some film and saying how 24 was just like real life. So the guy that actually runs the Department of Homeland Security was caught up in his own perceptual loop of pretending it's just like television. Another thing is we have this conditioning even in professional sports. The NFL has revenues of something like $10 billion a year, even though it's been a nonprofit. And yet, the military, the Department of Defense, has paid millions of dollars to NFL professional teams to stage patriotic displays during halftime.
Disgusting. Mike, that is disgusting what's happening now. I want to ask you a question more in general of the consequence of allowing the deep state to exist. Because right now it looks like it's pretty powerful in their control, and the political parties mean nothing, and you pointed that out, and there's so much control. But it seems to me like there are quite a few different elements involved here. One, you mentioned the Constitution and how they act outside the Constitution, so the issue of liberty is there. The issue of finance is there. Money keeps getting spent and it's going to special interests, and the country's getting poorer. We end up going to war in an unconstitutional fashion. Now, I'm looking for the wake-up call for the American people. And do you think there can be a wake-up call where they'll finally wake up and say, you know, we can't do it because the current system can't continue? I don't believe it can continue for a lot of reasons. One would be the finances and other things, and people get disgusted. Do you sort of anticipate that there will be a wake-up call? Or do you think we're at the early stages of that, where the people are going to speak out and say enough is enough and we need to change things?
Well, 6 months ago, as I was finishing up this book, I would not have anticipated some of the events we've seen now. What I'm about to say does not constitute either an endorsement or a critique of the policies of the people involved. But I will say, on the one hand, you've got Donald Trump and you've got Bernie Sanders, and their business models for campaigning, for raising money, the themes they operate off are scaring the daylights out of the party oligarchs. Because on one hand, you have Donald Trump, in his own extremely modest estimation, richer than God, saying he doesn't need money from oligarchs. And that appeals to a certain portion of the voters. These are people who maybe cannot connect the dots. They don't really have much knowledge of what's going on because commercial media make sure they don't know about it. They make sure they know about Kim Kardashian, but they know something's going wrong in the country, and Trump's extremely blunt appeal kind of appeals to them. Yeah. Sanders, on the other hand, is railing against the oligarchy of Wall Street, and he's got like 1 million plus contributors, and it's small amounts of money, less than $30. He's breaking the sort of Hillary mold where you declare your candidacy, then you go to Goldman Sachs and hold a fundraiser, then you jet out to the West Coast and have a fundraiser in David Geffen's mansion with all the glitterati. Right. We're seeing something different now.
Right. Mike, we're going to have to close shortly, but Daniel has another question for you, then we're going to finish up.
Well, I just wanted to remind the viewers that Mike Lofgren's new book, The Deep State, The Fall of the Constitution and the Rise of a Shadow Government. I would encourage people who are interested in this to purchase and read the book. Just a final thing I'd like to mention, Mike, and I guess this is slightly more of a comment. I really enjoyed, and thankfully we were able to put up on the Institute's website, a recent piece you did for Bill Moyers on the rise of the mega mansions in Washington, D.C. And you tied this appropriately enough, at least partially, to the rise of the military-industrial complex and the various cottage industries built up around that. And, you know, it's disgusting to me to see how wealthy Washington is, and I think middle America, who unfortunately is given a flag and told to celebrate patriotism, well, these people are getting rich off of these phony military state, security state. They're being ripped off in a big way, and I do hope, as Dr. Paul mentioned, that they may wake up to the fact that these are not the patriots inside the Beltway.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of S-Class Mercedes being driven around the Beltway right now that were bought with contracts based on permanent war, and for that matter, the permanent political campaign. We've got so many consultants, pollsters, and political operatives who also built their little mansions or McMansions based on the way we raise and spend money here.
Mike, I want to thank you very much for being with us today, and I hope our audience will pay attention and get hold of your book, The Deep State, because it has an important message, and it talks a lot about what we've been talking about for a long time on this program. But I want to thank the audience for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. And remember, we have to expose the government for what they're doing if we're ever going to get a change. And I think there are a lot of problems out there that we have to face up to. And unfortunately, we're going to have maybe a major crisis to come up with the right answers. I think people are waking up and realizing it. As Mike points out, they're starting to realize this. But boy, coming around to agreeing what really has to be done and be willing to go along, they're not ready for this, because right now you don't see Bernie Sanders talking about cutting spending or lowering taxes. No, raise taxes and more spending. And it's always the government that's going to do it, not recognizing the fact the government creates nothing. They have to steal it from somebody. So we are facing that crisis, and I think understanding the deep state and who really is our government makes the perfect point. There's no two-party system. Somebody asked me once whether I thought we should have a third party, and I said, no, we should have a second party, a freedom party, because right now the two parties are about one party. On occasion, there'll be one or two will stand out and try to change it from within. So far, it hasn't worked. So I think, of course, the easiest way to start on a problem like this is look to the Constitution and look for men and women of integrity if we're going to still work through the system of government that we have. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.